Hello.
Guess I need some perspective here. My name's John, and on the surface, you'd think I was just a regular guy, an IT specialist who spends his days in cubicles and code. My wife Houston, a legal secretary, knows I travel a lot for work, though she has no idea of the real reason I'm often gone. That's the thing, my life isn't exactly what it seems. I work undercover for a government agency. Let's just say it's the type of work where I can't afford to have anyone, not even Houston, know what I actually do. Most people would think of it as some sort of high-stakes double life, but to me it's just my job, something I leave at the door when I come home. Last night, I was finally home after a long assignment, looking forward to a quiet evening with Houston. But when I walked in, the place was set up like it was the anniversary dinner we never got around to. Candles, the best china, my wife in a dress that left little to the imagination. It threw me off. My first thought was she'd planned a surprise, but when I asked, Houston didn't smile. Instead, she looked at me with this strange, almost rehearsed calm and said she'd invited her boss, Greg, over for dinner. Now I know Greg. Not personally, but from the stories Houston's shared about work. She's mentioned him before, and it was never with much excitement. But last night, she told me she wanted to impress Greg to get in better with the partners at her firm. Said she'd been talking with him about what some men want in a marriage and how some wives find a way to satisfy those needs. She kept beating around the bush until she finally came out with it. Greg had convinced her it might help her career if she gave him a night to remember. According to her, Greg said that some husbands get off on watching their wives with other men. At first, I just laughed, thinking this had to be some twisted joke. But she stayed serious. Houston was actually considering it, looking at me like I was supposed to nod along. I told her no way. No favors for anyone, especially not some creep like Greg. But she didn't back down right away. Instead, she looked at me like I was the problem, hinting that maybe I didn't really understand her ambitions. In that moment, it felt like my world shifted. Houston gave me this smug little smile when I said no, like I was being naive, or just plain stupid. She sat there, swirling her wine, waiting for me to change my mind. But I was too stunned to react right away. After everything we'd been through, after the life we built together, she thought I'd be okay with her cozying up to some guy for the sake of her career? I didn't even recognize her in that moment. Greg's already on his way, John, she finally said, matter of fact, as if she'd just told me we were out of milk. I could barely keep my hands from shaking. You're serious about this? I asked, voice low. You actually want to invite this guy into our home, use our dishes, our table, and then what, Houston? Let him have you as part of some twisted deal. She sighed, rolling her eyes as if I was the one making things difficult. John, don't make this about you. This is a good opportunity. You think every couple's the same? Some men like to watch, some men are into it, and Greg just thinks you need to loosen up a little. He said it's about enlightened perspectives. It took everything I had not to shout. Instead, I forced myself to breathe calm, like I would in the field. It was instinct at this point. Slow the heart rate, focus, assess. I reminded myself that this wasn't a mission. This was my wife, the person I loved more than anything. But still, my training kicked in, and a clear plan started forming in my head. I stepped closer, keeping my voice steady. Listen, Houston, if you think I'm going to stand by while you throw yourself at Greg or anyone else, you're dead wrong. And if he thinks he can just show up here and disrespect our marriage, I stopped myself, taking a long breath. No, this isn't happening. If he so much as sets foot in this house, I'll handle him. Finally, she faltered, her confident mask slipping just a bit. Handle him, she scoffed, but I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Yeah, handle him, I said, voice firm. And if you care at all about this marriage, you'll back down now and cancel whatever this plan is. For the first time, Houston looked away, biting her lip. But then, like she was still caught up in Greg's twisted influence, she muttered, he'll be here any minute. Maybe you just talk to him? Get his side. No, I said immediately, cutting her off. I'm not about to talk to Greg. He's been manipulating you, Houston, and you've fallen for it. But if he thinks he's coming in here tonight, he's got another thing coming. She looked at me like she was trying to process everything I'd said, her expression a mix of frustration and worry. Finally, she muttered, fine. But he's coming here whether you like it or not. With that, she stormed off toward the kitchen, leaving me alone in the dining room, heart pounding as I waited for Greg to show up. I knew one thing for sure, this night was going to end a lot differently than he expected. So I waited, pacing the living room, trying to control the storm building up inside. My wife, the woman I'd promised to protect, was willing to give herself to some guy just to get ahead at work. I could hardly believe this was happening. And Greg, whoever he thought he was going to find out just how wrong he was to think he could worm his way into my marriage. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang, and Houston gave me one last look as if asking for permission. I shook my head. She sighed, went to the door, and opened it for Greg. The man walked in wearing some pretentious, expensive cologne, his hand gripping a bottle of wine like he was here for a cozy dinner party. He stepped inside like he owned the place, throwing a smile Houston's way before looking over at me. I didn't say a word, just stared him down. "Oh, you must be John." Greg smirked, holding out a hand like we were meeting for beers. I didn't move. "I know what you're here for," I said, keeping my voice low. "And I'll make this clear, you're not welcome here." Greg's smile barely faltered, his hand slowly dropping. He glanced at Houston, who looked away, and then back at me, looking unfazed. "John, this isn't what you think," he said with a smirk. "We're just here to see if you and Houston are open to new experiences." "You're not hearing me," I said, stepping forward, letting my own training steady my voice. "You are not welcome here. I don't care what ideas you've put in her head. Whatever arrangement you thought you'd have tonight is not happening." Greg let out a laugh, like he couldn't believe I was serious. "Oh, come on, man. I think maybe you're just nervous. We could talk about this first, ease into things." At that, I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh of my own. I stepped even closer, just inches from him now, and lowered my voice. "Let's get one thing straight, Greg. Houston may have been convinced by whatever garbage you've been feeding her, but I'm not. You thought you'd walk in here and just take what you want? You have no idea who you're dealing with." I could see it then, just the smallest crack in his confidence. He wasn't used to men standing up to him. Greg swallowed, glancing from me to Houston and back again. Finally, he forced a laugh. "Look, maybe this was a mistake." "Yeah, it was," I replied coldly. "And now, you're going to leave." Greg shifted awkwardly, his smug demeanor crumbling as he took a step back. I stood firm, making sure he knew I wasn't bluffing. After a long tense moment, he gave Houston a brief, embarrassed look and nodded. "Fine. I'll see myself out," he muttered, voice barely hiding his irritation. He turned and left, his footsteps quickening as he headed down the driveway. I waited until he was out of sight, then locked the door and turned to Houston, who was staring at the floor. "So, that's what you wanted?" I asked, barely keeping the bitterness out of my voice. She crossed her arms, still refusing to meet my gaze. "John, I thought it would help. I thought you might understand." Greg just made it sound like. "Made it sound like what?" I snapped. "Like he could buy his way into our marriage with a job offer?" Houston finally looked up at me, anger flashing in her eyes. "You don't get it. I'm trying to build something for myself, and Greg actually believes in me, unlike you." Her words hit hard, but I shook my head, refusing to let her turn this around. "Houston, I've always supported you, but I'm not about to let you throw yourself away on some lowlife, just because he says the right things. I don't care what he made you believe, you're worth more than that." She just looked at me, expression softening for the first time that night. Maybe I made a mistake," she mumbled, barely audible. "Maybe." I repeated, still reeling from the whole ordeal. Houston's shoulders slumped. "I don't know, John. I didn't know what else to do." And just like that, the anger drained from me, replaced by exhaustion. I took a deep breath and spoke quietly. "We need to talk, Houston. Really talk. About us, and whatever's going on here." For the first time, she nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. But even as we stood there, I knew this was far from over. We sat in silence at the dining room table, surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to be Greg's victory meal. The fancy dishes, the untouched bottle of wine, all of it just added insult to injury. Houston looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with the silverware and avoiding my gaze. "Start from the beginning," I said, my voice steady but firm. "How did it get to this point? Why him? Why this?" She sighed, her fingers tracing circles on the tablecloth. "It didn't start as this," she said slowly. "Greg's been giving me more responsibility at work, pushing me to go after bigger opportunities. I thought he saw something in me, believed in me." I clenched my jaw, nodding for her to go on. Then, a few weeks ago, he started talking to me about relationships. Said that marriages don't have to look one way, that sometimes men enjoy seeing their wives with others. That some men actually want it. I felt a surge of anger but forced myself to stay quiet, to let her talk. He made it sound normal, she went on, looking embarrassed. Like it's something people do when they trust each other. And when he mentioned he'd be open to helping me advance, I just thought, maybe it was worth it. I closed my eyes, the pieces finally clicking together. So he dangled a promotion in front of you, and suddenly, you were willing to risk everything? She shook her head quickly, almost defensively. I thought you'd understand. He made it sound like it would be a way for us to grow closer, to open up and try something new. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Grow closer? By inviting your boss into our bed? Houston, that's not opening up. That's just letting someone manipulate you into doing something you'd never do otherwise. She looked away, her face flushed. I didn't realize how wrong it was until you said it out loud like that. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my tone even. Look, Houston, I know you've been under a lot of pressure, and maybe this guy convinced you it was normal. But what about us, the trust we have? Did you really think this was something I'd ever be okay with? Her expression softened, and she looked at me, finally showing a bit of remorse. No, I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I just got caught up in the idea that this was something successful people do, or maybe I thought, if I did this, I'd finally feel like I was moving up in life. There it was. Houston's insecurities, her need to prove herself, had led her down this twisted path. I felt a mix of anger and pity, but mostly, I just felt disappointed. Houston, there's nothing wrong with ambition. But there's a line, and you crossed it tonight. She nodded, looking defeated. I know. He made me feel like this was my only shot at being taken seriously. Like I had to do this to finally get somewhere. I leaned back, running a hand through my hair, thinking hard. Then we're going to figure out a way to get you there without Greg or anyone else pulling strings. But I can't go through this again, Houston. I won't. She swallowed, nodding. I understand. The room fell silent, a heavy silence that hung between us, filled with unsaid words and broken trust. I didn't know if things would ever go back to how they were, but for the first time that night, I felt like maybe there was a chance to rebuild, if we were both willing to put in the work. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. After that conversation, things were tense. Houston apologized, even cried a little, but I could tell it wasn't just guilt she was feeling, it was anger too. I'd shattered her big break, and part of her couldn't forgive me for that. But I didn't care. I had to protect what we had left, even if that meant being the villain in her eyes. The next morning, she barely looked at me as she grabbed her coffee and went off to work. I thought that would be the end of it, that Greg would slink away and find some other way to manipulate his employees. But I underestimated him. That afternoon, I got a call on my work phone. I don't usually answer personal calls on that line, but when I saw Houston's office number, I picked up right away. John, she whispered, her voice tense and quiet. Greg's furious. He called me into his office first thing, asked me why I bailed on him last night. He's saying he'll make sure I never advance here, that I've made a career-limiting choice. I could feel my anger boiling up again. What do you mean he's threatening you? He said I embarrassed him and wasted his time. He was all smiles in front of everyone, but once the door was shut, he made it clear that I'd just lost any shot at a promotion. There was a pause as I tried to process the nerve of this guy. All right, Houston, listen. I'll handle it. She sounded nervous. John, please don't do anything drastic. I'm just telling you because I thought you should know. I can't afford to lose this job. I won't do anything to mess up your job, I promised, trying to keep my tone even. But he's not getting away with this. I hung up and took a long breath, trying to shake off the urge to storm over there and put an end to Greg's career. I couldn't afford to be reckless here, not with everything on the line. I had to think like I would on a mission, plan, prepare, and execute with precision. So, I did some digging. I may be an IT specialist to the outside world, but I know a few tricks when it comes to gathering information. And it didn't take long to find a trail. Greg had a reputation for this, preying on women under the guise of mentorship, whispering the same promises in their ears that he'd made to Houston. With a bit of finesse, I accessed his work emails, looking for anything I could use. It didn't take long to find it. Emails to multiple female employees, each one with the same tone, praising their potential, hinting at opportunities, always laced with compliments that crossed the line. I saved everything, building a nice little folder of evidence. Then I found something else. Greg wasn't just harassing employees, he'd been siphoning funds from the company. Little by little, skimming from accounts that were easy to miss. He thought he'd covered his tracks, but I'd seen enough of these tricks to recognize them immediately. That evening, I called Houston into the living room. "I found something," I said, showing her the file I'd put together. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the emails and the financial records. You did all this?" she asked, a bit of awe in her voice. I nodded. Greg's been playing this game for a long time, and he's got more to hide than just a few slimy emails. She looked at me, half impressed, half shocked. "What are we going to do with it?" "We're not doing anything," I said, my voice firm. "I'll handle it. But from here on out, I don't want you having any contact with him. Not a word. If he calls, if he emails, you ignore him." Houston nodded, relief and something else, maybe respect, flashing in her eyes. "All right, John. I'll stay out of it." But even as I spoke, I could feel the thrill of what was to come. Greg had tried to tear my marriage apart, humiliate my wife, and ruin her career. Now it was time for him to pay the price. And this time, I wasn't holding back. I spent the next day setting my plan in motion. First, I forwarded the emails and financial records to a few choice contacts who knew how to get the attention of people in high places. Greg's company had a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, and even the hint of financial misconduct would be enough to spark an investigation. By that evening, I'd received word. Greg's actions were officially under review, and a few higher-ups were starting to ask questions. Later, Houston came home looking a bit tense. "I haven't seen Greg all day," she told me, glancing over her shoulder like she was expecting him to appear out of thin air. "Rumor has it he's dealing with some audit issues." I just nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Good. That means the gears are turning." She looked at me with something that was almost a smile, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "John, I didn't know you could do all this." I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Guess I just know a thing or two about handling situations like this." As the evening settled in, I could tell she was starting to relax, the weight of Greg's threats lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in days, it felt like there was hope in the air. She reached for my hand across the table, a silent acknowledgement of what I'd done. But in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't over yet. Greg wasn't the type to go down quietly. I just had to be ready for whatever he tried next. The next few days were oddly quiet. Houston said Greg hadn't shown up at the office, and no one seemed to know why. A few people were whispering about an internal investigation, though Houston kept her head down, steering clear of any gossip. Then one evening, just as we were finishing dinner, Houston's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face turning pale. "It's Greg," she said, looking at me with a mix of dread and guilt. "Let it go to voicemail," I said, keeping my tone firm. She nodded, setting the phone down, but it buzzed again almost immediately. And again. This time, she reached over, hesitating. "Maybe he's calling to apologize," she mumbled, sounding more hopeful than convinced. I reached across the table, putting my hand on hers. "Houston, don't pick up. You don't owe him anything. And whatever he wants to say, it's not worth it." She seemed to wrestle with herself, her fingers hovering over the phone. Finally, she sighed, letting it go. "You're right." But then, my own phone buzzed. When I checked the screen, an unfamiliar number flashed across it. Part of me knew what was coming, but I picked up anyway. "John," a voice on the other end sneered. It was Greg, sounding colder, angrier than I'd ever heard him. "We need to talk." I didn't flinch. "About what?" "You think you're clever? You think you can just destroy my career and get away with it?" His voice was low, but the venom in it was unmistakable. I stayed silent, letting him keep talking. "You crossed a line, and I don't think you fully understand who you're dealing with," he continued. "I could make things very difficult for you and your wife." I glanced at Houston, who was watching me with wide eyes, listening in. I kept my voice calm. "Greg, you've got more than enough to worry about without dragging my wife into this. Do yourself a favor and back off." There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "Oh, I'll be back, all right. You've just opened a door, John. Let's see how well you handle what comes next." The line went dead, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Houston was staring at me, eyes full of fear. What did he mean by that? I looked at her, keeping my expression steady. He's just trying to scare us because he knows he's caught. But in the back of my mind, I was already planning my next move. Greg wasn't giving up, and he was clearly willing to play dirty. If he thought he could threaten my family, then he had no idea who he was really dealing with. This wasn't just about exposing him at work anymore. This was about protecting the life I'd built with Houston, no matter what it took. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, Greg's words echoed in my head. The next morning, I decided to take things up a notch. Before Houston left for work, I pulled her aside. I need you to be extra careful today. If he shows up or tries to contact you, don't respond. Go straight to HR if he makes any move. She nodded, but I could see the tension in her eyes. John, do you think he's serious about making things difficult for us? Serious or not, I'm not taking any chances. Once she was out the door, I got to work. Using some old agency contacts, I began tracing Greg's recent activity, seeing if he'd made any moves that could threaten us. I didn't expect him to have much of a record. Guys like Greg tend to keep a low profile, but I was wrong. Turns out, Greg had a history. I uncovered records of previous complaints that had somehow been quietly resolved. He had a few restraining orders filed against him by former female employees, which seemed to have disappeared, likely thanks to payoffs or intimidation. This was a pattern, and it was uglier than I'd realized. Armed with this information, I contacted someone who could put some public pressure on Greg's company, someone who knew how to leak things just right. With his history out in the open, Greg wouldn't just be dealing with an internal investigation, he'd be facing a scandal he couldn't silence. Later that day, as I waited for things to unfold, Houston texted me from work. Greg hasn't shown up again. No word on when he'll be back. Good. That meant my work was having an impact. But around dinner time, Houston got another text. This time, it was from an unknown number with no name, just a string of words that sent a chill down both our spines. This isn't over, Houston. We'll see who loses in the end. She showed me the message, her face pale. John, he's not going to stop, is he? I looked her in the eye. Not yet, but he will. He's desperate, trying to throw us off. We're winning, and he knows it. Houston held my gaze, her hand gripping mine tightly. I trust you, John. I don't know everything about what you do, but I know you'll protect us. And as she said those words, I made a silent vow. Greg had crossed the last line. No more warnings, no more playing nice. He wanted to see what I was capable of? Fine. I'd make sure he never saw it coming. The next morning, I went into full-on mission mode. First, I made a call to one of my most trusted contacts, a guy named Marcus who owed me a favor from years back. Marcus specialized in cleanup, the kind that ensures people don't make problems. He'd be subtle but effective, and right now, that was exactly what I needed. Hey Marcus, I said when he picked up. Got a situation that needs handling. Someone's crossed a line, and he's getting too close. Marcus didn't need a long explanation. Send me what you've got. I'll make sure he gets a reason to back off. Once I forwarded everything on Greg, I felt a small wave of relief. Marcus was discreet and efficient. Greg wouldn't know what hit him. But I couldn't leave it all to Marcus. I had my own steps to take. Later that afternoon, as I was working, I got a call from Houston. Her voice was shaky, a mix of excitement and nerves. John, you won't believe it. Greg's been suspended. HR told everyone there was an ongoing investigation into conduct violations. They didn't name names, but I could tell it was about him. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That's good, Houston. Just stay focused and keep a low profile. This isn't the time to draw attention. She paused, then said quietly, I just wanted to say, thank you, John. For everything. Hearing her say that made all the stress worth it, but I wasn't about to let my guard down yet. Later that evening, Marcus got back to me with some updates. It's done, he said. Greg's going to have a hard time finding anyone who'll want to help him now. I put out some well-placed reminders of his past, and word is spreading fast. I nodded, satisfied. Thanks, Marcus. That's exactly what I needed. Greg might not know it yet, but he was finished. By the time he tried to clear his name, the damage would already be done, his reputation in shambles. But then, just as I was feeling the weight lift, my phone buzzed with an alert. an email, this time directly to me. The subject line read, "Nice try, John." I opened it, and there, bold as brass, was a message from Greg himself. "Thought I'd disappear so easily? I know more about you than you think. Maybe I'll let a few secrets slip." My blood ran cold. Greg was cornered, but he'd just shown me he wasn't going down without dragging someone with him. And if he somehow knew about my past, this was about to get a whole lot messier. Seeing that email from Greg shook me, but I couldn't let it show. If he knew even a fraction of what I actually did for a living, it could jeopardize everything. Not just my job, but Houston, my life, the cover I'd worked years to protect. This had gone way beyond a career grudge or harassment. Now, Greg was pushing into dangerous territory. I took a moment, then replied to his email, keeping it short. "Meet me tonight. We'll talk." I knew he'd take the bait. Greg liked control, and he'd jump at any chance to prove he had the upper hand. Within minutes, he responded, "Downtown parking garage, 9 p.m. level 3. The parking garage was the kind of place where you could go unseen, and Greg probably thought that meant he'd be safe to pull some stunt. He didn't realize that I was no stranger to situations like this. If he wanted to play this game, he'd be the one coming out worse. That night, I left early, telling Houston I had some errands to run. She was used to these vague explanations, though tonight she looked at me with a hint of worry. "Are you sure everything's all right?" she asked, searching my face. "Just a quick work thing," I said, managing a reassuring smile. "I'll be back soon." When I arrived at the parking garage, it was nearly empty, dimly lit with only the occasional hum of a car engine in the distance. I parked and waited, watching the entrance until I saw Greg's silver sedan pull in. He parked a few spaces down and stepped out, dressed in a sharp suit, as if he were still clinging to the illusion of authority. He smirked when he saw me, strolling over with that same arrogance that had gotten him into this mess. "You really think you can scare me, John?" he sneered. "You're just an IT guy playing detective." I stayed calm, keeping my eyes steady on him. "You've overplayed your hand, Greg. You're about to lose your job, your reputation, and everything else. Walk away now, and maybe you won't lose more than that." But Greg's smirk didn't fade. He stepped closer, a mocking tone in his voice. "You know, I did some digging of my own, and I found some interesting things. Government work, wasn't it? A few too many secrets in your background. You wouldn't want Houston to find out, would you?" I felt a surge of anger, but I forced myself to stay still. "You're bluffing, Greg. You don't know anything about me." He laughed, clearly enjoying himself. "Maybe I don't know all the details, but I know enough to make things very uncomfortable for you. Maybe I'll leak a few things, see how fast your little life unravels." In that moment, I realized there was no reasoning with him. Greg was cornered, desperate, and that made him dangerous. I stepped forward, lowering my voice. "Last chance, Greg. Walk away and disappear, or you'll regret staying in this game." His expression faltered just a bit, and he took a half step back, but his pride wouldn't let him give in. "You don't scare me." I nodded slowly. "You don't have to be scared. Just smart." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the shadows of the garage. By the time he realized just how serious I was, it would be too late. I'd made arrangements to protect my identity if he tried anything, but more than that, I'd just given Marcus one final instruction: make sure Greg was done, once and for all. Tonight was the end. I drove home in silence, mind racing as I replayed the confrontation. Greg was too arrogant to realize the kind of fire he was playing with, but I knew this was his final move. By morning, he'd be dealing with fallout he couldn't talk or bribe his way out of. When I walked through the door, Houston was waiting for me. She tried to hide her worry, but it was written all over her face. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. I nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "It's handled." She watched me closely, searching for anything that might hint at what was going on beneath the surface. "Handled? You mean Greg?" I took a breath, debating how much to tell her. "He won't be bothering us again, Houston. He's got his own problems to deal with now." She looked relieved, but still hesitant. "John, I don't want to know everything. But, I just want to say thank you. For protecting me, for fixing all of this. I don't deserve it." I could see the remorse in her eyes, the regret that had been building up since that first night. I reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We've both made mistakes, Houston. But we're here now, and that's what matters. A flicker of a smile crossed her face, and she leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. For the first time in days, it felt like the weight of Greg's shadow was finally lifting. We were moving forward. The next morning, I received a message from Marcus. It's done. Our friend won't be a problem. Later, Houston came home from work, her face lit with relief. John, you wouldn't believe it. Greg's been terminated. They said the investigation uncovered major misconduct. He's completely blacklisted from the firm, and they're reporting him to the authorities. Good, I said, trying not to show too much satisfaction. Thank you, John, she said, reaching for my hand. Thank you for everything. That night, we sat together on the couch, a quiet peace settling over us. The ordeal with Greg had nearly destroyed us, but it felt like we'd come out stronger. As I held her hand, I realized just how close we'd come to losing everything, and just how far I'd gone to protect it. But in the end, it had been worth it. Greg was gone, and as far as I was concerned, this chapter of our lives was closed. Or so I thought. Because just when I started to believe it was over, something happened that I never saw coming. The next day was supposed to be our first real day of peace. I even took the day off to spend it with Houston, planning on getting back to normal, just us. But mid-morning, Houston's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It's my friend Jess from work. She never calls on weekends. I nodded, urging her to pick up. Go ahead. As soon as she answered, her face went pale. I couldn't hear the other end, but whatever Jess was saying had Houston's eyes widening with fear. Wait, slow down, Jess. What happened? She listened in silence, then hung up, looking like she'd just seen a ghost. John, Greg's been arrested. I frowned, a mixture of relief and confusion. Good. That's what we wanted, right? Yeah, she said slowly, but that's not all. Jess said that before the police came, Greg sent out some kind of email blast to the entire company. They're saying it was full of rants about how he was being set up and how he'd been betrayed. He mentioned my name, John. And, she trailed off, looking at me like she couldn't bear to say it. What else? I prompted, feeling my own pulse start to quicken. He said he was exposing the truth about you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He wrote that you're not who you say you are, that you're hiding things. He hinted that you're involved in government secrets. I clenched my fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. Greg had gone for a final blow, even knowing it would only hurt him more. He was banking on the idea that if he couldn't win, he'd drag me down with him. It's nothing but desperation, I said, trying to keep my tone calm for her sake. No one's going to believe a disgraced former employee's last-minute ramblings. But Houston still looked uneasy. What if people start asking questions? What if this all comes back on you? I put my hand on her shoulder, meeting her gaze. Then I'll handle it. Just like I've handled everything else. Greg's finished, and there's no evidence to back up his lies. She nodded, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. We spent the day trying to shake it off, but there was an unspoken tension lingering between us, like the ghost of Greg's accusation still hung over our heads. Later that evening, just as we were finally starting to relax, my phone buzzed with an alert. It was from my agency contact. We need to talk. Greg's claims have caught attention. I felt my stomach drop. Greg's last move had set off a chain reaction, and now, I was officially in dangerous territory. I stepped outside, dialing my agency contact with a feeling of dread that I hadn't felt in years. This was the call I'd hoped to avoid, the one where my double life might finally catch up to me. The line clicked, and my contact answered in a voice edged with caution. John, we've got a situation. This Greg guy's claims have stirred up just enough chatter that a few higher-ups are asking questions. Normally, it wouldn't be an issue, but since it came from a public incident, we have to respond. I kept my voice steady. What does that mean, exactly? It means the agency's monitoring any mention of you and Greg's accusations. We're controlling the narrative for now, but any further leaks or issues, and it could be beyond containment. There was a pause. We might need to pull you in for questioning for show, just to keep it contained. I knew what that meant. If that happens, my cover's blown. And Houston. We'll do what we can to avoid that, John. But Greg's unstable, and if he tries to spread more information, or if anything you did to handle him comes out. I interrupted, keeping my tone even. Understood. I'll make sure nothing else surfaces. I hung up, feeling the weight of this new threat pressing down on me. Going inside, I found Houston waiting, her face tight with concern. "What's happening, John?" I hesitated, wanting to protect her, but she needed to know the truth. "Greg's accusations have triggered some agency interest. They're keeping tabs on me, on us, until this blows over." Houston looked stricken. "What if it doesn't blow over? What if they find out everything?" I took her hands in mine, trying to reassure her. "They won't. But I need you to trust me, now more than ever. Greg's trying to ruin us, but he's not going to win. We'll stay careful. No one else needs to know what happened between us and him, especially about that final meeting." Her grip tightened, and she nodded, though her eyes still showed fear. "I trust you, John. Just promise me this is almost over." I looked her in the eye, a silent vow passing between us. "I promise." But inside, I knew that Greg's final move had pushed us to the edge, and that I had to end this, once and for all, before it went any further. The next day, I made a decision. If I was going to protect my life with Houston, I had to silence Greg for good, not just professionally but personally. I needed leverage that would keep him out of our lives permanently. So I spent the day gathering every bit of dirt I could find on him. Contacts, failed business ventures, and personal secrets that only someone with my skill set could uncover. By evening, I had what I needed. Greg's history wasn't just about harassment and embezzlement. There was a record, sealed but accessible to me, of a domestic violence incident years ago. His ex-wife had filed a restraining order, claiming he'd threatened her life during their divorce. That record was damning enough to put him on a blacklist for any reputable employer, and if I leaked it to certain channels, it would ruin him in every social circle he frequented. As I sat across from Houston at dinner, I decided it was time to tell her. "I found something that'll put an end to this," I said, voice low. She looked at me, eyes wary but hopeful. "What is it?" "Greg's got a past that he's tried to keep hidden. If I expose it, he'll lose any credibility left. It'll make him unhireable, untouchable. He'll have no choice but to leave us alone." Houston's relief was obvious, but I could tell she was holding back. "John, I don't want you to have to do this. I mean, he's already lost his job, his reputation at work. Maybe that's enough." I shook my head. "Not for Greg. He's too prideful. He's already tried to lash out. If I let this go, he'll find another way to retaliate. This is the only way to make sure he stays down." She reached across the table, taking my hand. "Then do what you have to do. Just promise me this ends here. I can't live like this, looking over my shoulder every day." I nodded, squeezing her hand. "I promise. After tonight, we're done with him." After Houston went to bed, I made the final arrangements. I sent Greg a message, detailing everything I'd found, attaching a few key documents as proof. "Disappear quietly, or this goes public. The choice is yours." I knew Greg would get the message loud and clear. By morning, he'd have two choices: walk away, or face the consequences I'd laid out for him. One way or another, this was going to be over. And with that, I finally allowed myself to breathe, knowing that the nightmare Greg had brought into our lives was finally coming to an end. The next morning, I checked my phone the second I woke up, hoping for some sign that Greg had backed down. But there was no reply, no response to my message, just a void that kept me on edge all morning. Houston noticed my unease, but I did my best to reassure her, even though I could feel the tension in my gut growing. By noon, though, my phone finally buzzed. It was a response from Greg. "Meet me one last time. Same place as before. No more threats, face to face." I read the message twice, weighing my options. It could be a trap, but I knew Greg wouldn't leave without feeling like he'd had the last word. So I agreed, telling him I'd meet him at the parking garage that evening. If he wanted closure, I'd give him closure. That evening, I told Houston I had to go out for a bit, but promised I'd be back soon. She nodded, worry clear in her eyes, but didn't question it. She'd seen enough to understand that sometimes, there were things I couldn't explain. I gave her a quick kiss and left, feeling the weight of finality settle over me. When I arrived at the garage, Greg was already there, leaning against his car, arms crossed. He straightened as he saw me approach, that same smug expression on his face that made my skin crawl. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you, John?" he sneered. The devoted husband swooping in to rescue his wife from the big bad wolf. I stood there, silent, letting him talk. "But you know what? You're not the only one with secrets. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket, dangling it between us. You're not the only one who can dig up dirt. He tossed it at me, and I caught it without flinching, meeting his gaze. What's on here? Enough to make things uncomfortable for you, he said, his voice oozing with satisfaction. Bank transactions, suspicious locations, unexplained disappearances. Let's just say it doesn't paint you as the IT guy your wife thinks you are. I clenched my jaw, realizing he'd somehow managed to pull bits and pieces of my cover apart. It wasn't much, nothing incriminating on its own, but it was enough to draw attention. The wrong kind of attention. You're grasping at straws, Greg, I said evenly. There's nothing on here that'll save you. And if you even try to use it, I'll make sure that every detail of your own life goes public. He smirked, almost laughing. See, that's where you're wrong. I don't need to use it. I just need you to know that I have it. That you're not untouchable. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. And what's your plan, Greg? Hold this over my head? Blackmail me for some twisted sense of revenge? He held my gaze, his smirk fading just slightly. I just want you to know that no one's perfect, John. Not even you. In that moment, I understood that Greg had no real plan. This was his last desperate attempt to cling to control, to feel powerful in a situation where he was losing everything. He thought this flash drive was his ticket to scare me, but he'd miscalculated. You know what, Greg? I said, voice cold. You're right. No one's perfect. But some of us know how to end things when it's time. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small device, a signal jammer, just enough to keep any digital evidence from transmitting if he tried anything. I stepped back, tossing the flash drive on the ground and crushing it under my foot. Greg's face fell, his confidence shattered in that single, final moment. You think this is over, he spat, though his voice wavered. You think you can just erase everything? I met his gaze, unflinching. Yes. And this is your last chance, Greg. Walk away. Go somewhere far from here, and don't come back. Because if I see or hear about you again, you won't like what comes next. He stood there, silent, the realization sinking in. He'd lost. Completely. I saw his shoulders slump, his face pale, and without another word he turned, walking back to his car. He didn't look back, didn't say anything. Just got in and drove off, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. Greg was gone, and this time, I knew it was for good. I'd left him with no choice but to disappear, to fade into the background where he couldn't touch us. When I got home, Houston was waiting, her face anxious. She rushed to me, relief flooding her expression as I took her hand. Is it over? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, pulling her into my arms. It's over. He's gone. For good. She let out a shaky breath, leaning into me as if letting go of all the fear she'd been holding. I can't believe it. Neither could I, but it was done. We'd been through hell, seen the worst of betrayal and manipulation, but we'd come out the other side. And as I held her, I knew one thing for certain: nothing, no one would ever come between us again.
Bye.